Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. Chief Justice of India Sharad Bobde has recommended Justice N.V. Ramanna, the senior most judge of the Supreme Court, as the next Chief Justice of India. So the current Chief Justice of India, who heads the Supreme Court's collegium, has made a formal recommendation to the government that the senior-most judge of the Supreme Court, Justice N.V. Ramanna, should be appointed as the 48th Chief Justice of India by the President. So this development provides us an opportunity to talk about the procedure involved in judicial appointments. See, be it the Chief Justice of India, the Supreme Court judges, or the Chief Justice of the High Court and the High Court judges, they are all appointed by the President of India as mandated by the Indian Constitution. With regard to the appointment of the Chief Justice of India, the outgoing Chief Justice of India recommends his successor, and the established practice is that the senior most judge of the Supreme Court is recommended by the outgoing Chief Justice of India to be appointed as the next Chief Justice by the President. But however, in the 1970s, for a brief period, this convention was violated for a few times, and a couple of Chief Justices were appointed by superseding seniority in the Supreme Court, thus triggering a major controversy in the process of judicial appointments, leading to a conflict between the judiciary and the executive. But however, since the 1990s, this conflict has been resolved with the establishment of the collegium system of appointment, and accordingly, the outgoing CJI recommends the name of the senior-most Supreme Court judge to be appointed as the next Chief Justice. And with regard to the other judges of the Supreme Court, the proposal is initiated by the Chief Justice of India. In case of other judges of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice is bound to consult with the rest of the collegium and as well as with the Chief Justice of the concerned High Court from where the recommended judge hails from. All those who are consulted by the CJI as a part of the collegium system, they need to record their opinions in writing. And finally, based on majority decision of the collegium, the names are recommended to the Union Law Minister. Then the Law Ministry forwards the proposal to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister in turn has to advise the President to appoint these judges as the judges of the Supreme Court. So it is this collegium system which plays a pivotal role in the appointment of judges and as well as in the transfer of judges. If you look at the appointment of Chief Justices to High Courts, there is a convention that is followed. The convention is that the one who is appointed as the Chief Justice of a High Court should be from outside the respective state, and their names are chosen by the Supreme Court Collegium. Even for appointing judges to the High Court, the decision is taken by the Supreme Court Collegium, comprising the Chief Justice of India and the four senior-most judges of the Supreme Court. But however, in this case, the proposal is initiated at the High Court by the outgoing Chief Justice of the High Court in consultation with senior-most judges of the High Court. Their recommendation is forwarded to the Chief Minister, who then advises the Governor to send the proposal to the Union Law Minister. But the final call on this proposal is taken by the Supreme Court Collegium, and according to its recommendation, the Union Law Minister recommends the name to the Prime Minister, who in turn advises the President to appoint them as the Chief Justice of the High Court and as the judges of the High Court. This collegium system of appointment and transfer of judges has evolved through a series of judgments that have been passed by the Supreme Court. It is not a result of an act passed by the Parliament, and neither it's a constitutional provision. The evolution of the collegium system can be traced back to the first judge's case of 1981-82, and in this case, a constitution bench of the Supreme Court was looking into the question of appointment of judges following the supersession controversy of the 1970s. See, the constitution states that the President shall appoint the judges following consultation with such judges of the Supreme Court and the High Court. The key word in this constitutional provision is the word consultation. In the 1970s, when the government superseded seniority, a dispute emerged between the judiciary and the executive over the true meaning of the word consultation in this constitutional provision. In the first judge's case of 1981, the Supreme Court declared that the primacy of the Chief Justice of India and his recommendations on judicial appointments and transfers can be refused by the government for cogent and valid reasons. Because in this case, the Supreme Court interpreted the word consultation as not mandatory concurrence of the government, and instead, it held that the word consultation meant a mere exchange of views between the judiciary and the government. This ruling gave the executive primacy over judicial appointments for almost another 12 years. Then in 1993, through the second judge's case, the Supreme Court introduced the collegium system, which completely restricted the role of the executive in making judicial appointments and established the primacy of the judiciary itself in making such judicial appointments. In this case, the Supreme Court interpreted the word consultation to really mean concurrence, because according to the Constitution bench, the opinion provided by the Chief Justice was not just an individual opinion, but an institutional opinion. Because in his capacity, the Chief Justice of India is not giving his individual opinion on the recommendation of names, but instead he is consulting with two senior most judges of the Supreme Court prior to making these recommendations. Hence, the Supreme Court ruled in the second judge's case that consultation really meant concurrence, and hence the government was bound to appoint the judges who are recommended by the collegium. Then later in 1998, through the third judge's case, the Supreme Court expanded the membership of the collegium based on a reference from the president. And since then, the collegium has become a 5-member body, which includes the Chief Justice of India and as well as 4 senior-most judges of the Supreme Court. Similar to this composition of the Supreme Court collegium, the High Court collegium is also headed by the Chief Justice of the High Court and 4 other senior-most judges of that court. So the establishment of the collegium system by the Supreme Court in the 1990s has cut the role of the government in making judicial appointments, and its role is merely a formal role to ensure that the appointment process is carried out by the president based on the recommendations of the collegium as mandated by the Constitution. As a result of the collegium system, the government's role gets limited to the task of conducting a background check on the recommended names through the Intelligence Bureau before they are appointed or elevated as judges to the High Court or the Supreme Court. Then also note that once the collegium has given its recommendation, the government might raise some objections and seek clarifications. So after receiving the list of recommended names from the collegium, the government can seek clarifications and raise objection once. But if the collegium reiterates the same names, then the government is bound to appoint them as judges, thus highlighting the limited role of the government in the appointment of judges. But however, neither the Constitution nor the Supreme Court has clarified on the time limit within which the government has to make these appointments, and hence there are often long delays in the appointment and elevation of judges, especially when the government is not happy with the names that have been recommended by the collegium. But eventually the government has no choice under the current system, and it has to provide for the appointment of the recommended names by suitably advising the president. This collegium system has come in for a lot of criticism because legal experts point out that the collegium system is completely opaque and lacks transparency. Because this essentially is a system where the judges are appointing themselves. So such a closed system that is not based on merit creates scope for nepotism and favoritism, and the strict adherence to seniority also compromises merit, and any controversial appointment could also trigger a major scandal, thus affecting the image of the judiciary. India is probably the only major democracy where we still have such a closed collegium system of appointing judges, because in all the other major democracies, be it United Kingdom, US and the others, they have a merit-based appointment system, which is much more transparent and accountable as compared to the Indian collegium system. Back in 2014, the government made an attempt to replace the collegium system with a National Judicial Appointments Commission by introducing the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act by passing the National Judicial Appointments Commission Act through the Parliament. The composition of this commission was such that it provided for shared responsibility between the judiciary, the government and the civil society to decide upon appointments to the judiciary, and it sought to replace the collegium system, which until then was entirely dominated by the judiciary itself. But the passage of this act triggered a major controversy because the Supreme Court set up a constitution bench to evaluate the constitutional validity of this law. Eventually in 2015, following this review, the Supreme Court struck down the NJAC as unconstitutional by labeling it as a threat to the independence of the judiciary. The Constitutional Bench of the Supreme Court argued that by providing a role for the executive in judicial appointments, the independence of the judiciary was being compromised, which is one of the core aspects of the basic structure doctrine to the Indian Constitution. Following this ruling, NJAC was declared as unconstitutional and the collegium system was brought back by the Supreme Court. Now let's look at an editorial from page number 6 that evaluates India's decision to abstain while voting on a UNHRC resolution that targeted the Sri Lankan government. We have covered the background to this topic in complete detail on the 19th of March. So let's proceed to understand the significance of India's decision to abstain from the UNHRC vote. The editorial calls this decision of India to abstain from the vote as a tactical abstention that helps India preserve its diplomatic space. See, the UNHRC resolution that was sponsored by Western governments targeted the Sri Lankan government over accusations of gross human rights violations and war crimes that were allegedly committed by the Sri Lankan security forces against the Tamil minorities during the last phase of the civil war. So this UNHRC resolution was seeking to hold the Sri Lankan government and the Sri Lankan forces accountable in order to provide justice to the Tamil minorities who were affected during the last phase of the civil war. See, this conflict in Sri Lanka has always posed a policy dilemma for India. Because on one hand, India is a direct stakeholder in ensuring the well-being of the Tamil minorities due to their historical, cultural and familial links with the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. So India has always had the moral obligation to defend the Tamil minorities in Sri Lanka in the interest of ensuring their well-being and protecting their political rights. But at the same time, the Sri Lankan government is a key ally for India in the Indian Ocean region. And Sri Lanka being an immediate neighbor, it has direct stakes in ensuring the national security of India. As we have discussed on the 19th of March, India's involvement in Sri Lanka's internal affairs back in the 1980s had become very controversial. But following the end of the civil war in 2009, India has tried to play a positive, proactive role in order to strike a balance between its differing objectives in Sri Lanka. See, ever since this UNHRC resolution came up back in 2012, India has always opposed any motivated external investigation, and India has a long history of opposing such external investigation sponsored by few countries against a target country, as it feels that such investigations could violate the sovereignty of that country. But at the same time, India was well aware of the grave allegations that were emerging from Sri Lanka, and there was even sufficient prima facie evidence to show that the Sri Lankan forces, with the approval of the Sri Lankan government, had indeed committed gross human rights violations during the last phase of the civil war against the Tamil minorities. In the name of targeting the LTTE, the insurgent outfit that was fighting for a Tamil Eelam, reportedly even innocent Tamil civilians were targeted by the Sri Lankan forces in the northern and eastern provinces. For several decades, the Tamil minorities have felt oppressed in Sri Lanka at the hands of the Sinhala Buddhist majority, and beginning right from the 1950s, their political rights have been slowly snatched away, leading to their oppression and leading to the denial of basic rights such as equality and dignity. So following the end of the civil war, India wanted to ensure that there was transparency and accountability as far as these allegations of war crimes were concerned. But at the same time, India was motivated by the need to protect the Sri Lankan government from any external investigation sponsored by Western governments, considering the rising influence of China in Sri Lanka and considering the growing closeness of the Rajapaksa family with China. But at the same time, India also had to keep in mind the overall well-being and dignity of the Tamil minorities and the sentiments in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu, as the subject is an emotive subject that plays a direct role in the politics of Tamil Nadu. And this pressure from Tamil Nadu had even led India to vote against Sri Lanka in 2012 and 13 when the UNHRC resolution was brought up against it. Back then as well, India was driven by pragmatism and it was keen to defend its strategic space in Sri Lanka from the growing Chinese influence in the country. But eventually the Indian government couldn't support Sri Lanka or help out the Sri Lankan government in 2012 and 13 because political pressure from Tamil Nadu forced the Indian government to vote against Sri Lanka in favor of the resolution. But in 2014 and 2021, India has chosen to abstain from the vote in order to strike a balance between the conflicting objectives so that it can preserve its diplomatic space for the future. See, on one hand, for India, it's a pragmatic need to keep Chinese influence away from Sri Lanka by supporting the Sri Lankan government at the United Nations Human Rights Council. But at the same time, India has a principled commitment based on morals and ideals to protect the Tamil cause. Because, especially of late, there is a growing concern about rising majoritarianism and anti minority feelings in Sri Lanka. So, considering this dilemma, India decided to abstain from the vote in order to strike a middle path. And this does not indicate any weakness on India's part because this is a tactical decision of India to preserve its diplomatic space for the future so that India can put pressure on Sri Lanka in order to protect and defend the Tamil cause. Right now, India's decision to abstain has been welcomed by Sri Lanka, and this indicates that India's decision to abstain was driven by its strategic need to cut Chinese influence in the country. During this voting, India couldn't afford to vote against Sri Lanka because China was already rallying support for Sri Lanka at the UNHRC. So it was very essential for India to be seen to be supportive of Sri Lanka, and the only way that India could do this was by abstaining from the vote. But at the same time, it helps India preserve its diplomatic options for the future. And if the rights of the Tamil minorities are not taken care of in Sri Lanka, then India could always use this space to put pressure on Sri Lanka for ensuring the full devolution of powers to the northern and eastern provinces by providing for the complete implementation of the 13th Amendment as promised by the Sri Lankan government under the India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the writer carries out an assessment of India's counter to the Western allegations of diminishing democracy in India. See, of late, India has come under attack from several Western institutions, claiming that there has been an erosion of democratic values in India as a result of increasing curbs on free speech and human rights. A large part of this criticism comes from Western countries such as United States and United Kingdom and a few West European nations. In the United States, the US Congress, a few think tanks based out of the United States, and a few celebrities have often taken a stand against India, pointing out the erosion of democracy in the country. For example, recently, the US-based Freedom House brought out a report highlighting the erosion of democratic values in India. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, its parliament and civil society have taken a shot against India with regard to the ongoing farmers' protests and as well as on several other contentious issues such as the human rights situation in Kashmir and the revocation of Article 370, the frequent suspension of internet in India, and as well as the curbs on press freedom, especially the targeting of free speech and expression on the internet through rules and regulations, have become a matter of discussion in Western countries, and it has led to criticism against India, leading to assumptions that democracy in India is on the decline. In response to these accusations, India has responded aggressively, and it has labeled all these matters as the internal matters of India, and it has asserted the autonomy and independence of its democratic institutions while defending its sovereignty. For example, in response to a discussion in the British Parliament on the farmers' protests, the Indian High Commission in London issued a strongly worded statement, and this was accompanied with a strong response from the Ministry of External Affairs and from the Foreign Minister himself. So, in all these cases, India's response has been quite aggressive and assertive, and according to the writer, India is able to do this because today India's global profile has grown significantly because the Western countries need India for their own economic, environmental, and geopolitical reasons. The ongoing pandemic in itself is an example of India's growing profile because the pandemic has not only spared India as compared to the Western countries, but through its strength in vaccine manufacturing, India has launched the Vaccine Maitri initiative and supplied vaccines to more than 70 countries. And this, along with India's coordinated response to the pandemic, makes India look like a coherent functional democracy as compared to the Western countries where the pandemic has wreaked havoc, and this accompanied with their inconsistent response places the Western countries on a weaker footing. Then it should also be noted that the Indian government has cultivated a few conservative allies in these Western countries to support India's position, and this has helped India to rightfully defend its sovereignty by conveniently labeling these accusations as a result of Western arrogance and as a result of continuing Western imperialism. India's foreign minister even went to the extent of stating that democracies around the world are not the same, and there was no obligation on India to follow the Western standards of democracy. So, the writer of this column appreciates the aggressive response of India as it is well within its rights to defend itself against these accusations. But, however, he raises a very important question that whether the definition of democratic principles and human rights is subjective to each country, or are they universal values that apply in any context in any setting. In his assessment, the writer says that India has engaged its international critics based only on values and not on facts, and hence he calls upon the Indian government to make its position clear as to what constitutes a functioning democracy that respects human rights and free speech according to its interpretation. He says that this debate shouldn't be limited to the conflict between Western arrogance and Indian interests, but rather it should focus on the universal values of democracy and human rights, which needs to be respected and upheld by every government, irrespective of the setting and irrespective of the context. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, in which the writer evaluates the challenges posed by water pollution. See, polluted water is a breeding ground for various waterborne diseases, and it is known to contain several pathogens, including disease-causing viruses. According to a study conducted by the Niti Aayog along with WaterAid, 70% of India's freshwater sources, that includes both surface water and groundwater, is heavily contaminated. So it basically means that most of our freshwater resources that we are currently consuming, they're already contaminated with disease-causing pathogens such as deadly viruses. Then the writer illustrates how the COVID-19 pandemic is largely a result to unsustainable human activity which has contributed to severe environmental degradation. He argues that the jump of the SARS coronavirus 2 to humans is a direct result of mutations amongst various animals that has been accelerated due to the mass production of animals in the animal husbandry industry. He says that in the wild, animals were far away from human habitations, thereby keeping humans isolated from deadly pathogens. But the artificial environment that we have created, that is based on mass production, has led to the overexploitation of the animal husbandry industry, which not only brings animals closer to humans, but also promotes the accelerated breeding of various mutations of these deadly pathogens. According to the writer, eventually these pathogens, they find their way into water sources through wastewater. Now, this is very true with regard to SARS coronavirus 2 because its traces can already be found in wastewater samples around the world. So in this context, the writer cautions that if we have to avoid a future pandemic, we need to focus on fresh, unpolluted sources of water. See, currently, most of the surface water and groundwater is highly contaminated, and especially in developing countries like India, which are overpopulated, the only way in which this unclean water can be purified is through the usage of technological interventions such as reverse osmosis, UV filtration, etc. But all these technologies are cost prohibitive and they have their own downside to the environment. Plus, it's practically impossible to find a technological substitute for such a precious natural resource. See, the Jal Shakti Ministry has come out with an ambitious plan to provide tap water connections under the Nal Se Jal initiative. But the writer points out that even if India succeeds in this initiative, eventually the water that is being supplied would be contaminated water. Mass dependency on reverse osmosis and UV filtration is not only cost prohibitive but also unfriendly to the environment. In this context, he suggests that we should sustainably exploit the two remaining unpolluted freshwater sources, which includes the water that is present below the forests and the aquifers that are present below the floodplains of rivers. These water sources are virgin and untapped, and these water sources are an outcome of millions of years of evolution. And as they contain fresh, unpolluted water, he urges the governments around the world to declare them as water sanctuaries and promote the sustainable exploitation of these unpolluted water sources. These untapped sources of water, they are replenished through rains, and if exploited sustainably, it will help in fulfilling the need for human consumption while balancing the environmental obligations. Now, finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: write a note on the appointment process of the Chief Justice of India. The second question: India's decision to abstain from the UNHRC vote against Sri Lanka was a tactical abstention. Critically evaluate. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.